All right, guys, so now we're going to look at form submission. In the last video, we looked at events on specific inputs so that you could do something when something in that input changed. Now we're dealing with actually submitting the form. Now, as I mentioned in the end of the last video, if you're working with a backend technology like, let's say, Node.js or PHP or something like that, then your form tag may have an action that submits to some file on your back end. It could be Node.js, it could be PHP, or whatever it might be. But we're dealing with front-end JavaScript. So what we want to do is go into our script file and let's get the form. And I think the form has an ID. Yeah, it has an ID of item form. So let's say const, and we'll get our form. We'll set that to document dot get element by ID, and it has an ID of item dash form. All right, so now we just want to add an event listener to that form, and we want to listen for the submit event. And when that happens, we'll have a function called onSubmit fire off. So let's add that. Say function onSubmit, pass in our event object. Okay, now I'm just going to do a console log here, and we'll say submit. And I'm going to open up the console. And by the way, I still have the priority select list here because I want to use that as well. But you'll see if I put something in here and I click add item, watch down here. So notice how it just flashed submit real quick. That's because it did do the console log, but then it submitted to the actual file. If you don't have an action attribute on your form where you're submitting to some kind of back end, then it's going to submit to the same page. All right, now to stop that, you can just say e.prevent default. Okay, we looked at this a while back. This prevents the default behavior. So now if I put something in here and I click add item, it doesn't submit to the file. Okay, it stops, and then it does whatever I want in the front end JavaScript, which in this case is just a console log. Now, obviously, if you're doing this, you're going to want to get the values that are being submitted to the form. So there's actually a few ways to do that. I'm going to show you the first way, which I really already showed you, and that's to use the value, target.value. But there's also a form data object that you can use as well. So to use the value, what I'll do is I'll put basically we have the item and we have the priority. So we have two fields. So I'm going to set item to document dot, and we'll say get element by ID, and that has an ID of item dash input. And then we also want the priority input. And I'll just set this variable to priority. Okay, so to get the value, now obviously like if I console log here, let's do item and priority. Whoops. Okay, and if I put something in here, milk 1, so it's giving me the actual element, which I don't want. So we can just add on to this dot value. You could do it like this, where you set the initial variable to value and then print it, or you can set it to the element, and then when you're ready to use it, you can then say dot value. So both of these will work. If I put milk 1 and add, we get milk and 1. So it's up to you on how you want to do this. I usually do it this way, but of course there's all kinds of different scenarios. Now, this is where your front-end JavaScript. This is where you'll do some validation, and you should have both front-end and back-end validation. If you're submitting to some kind of back-end API, you should do validation here, but you should also do it on the server side. So whatever route you're submitting to, you want to check your form fields and stuff like that on the server as well. I'm just going to add dot value here just to be consistent. All right, and then what I want to do is just check, let's say if, and we'll say if item, we just want to make sure it's filled. So we'll say if item equals nothing, and then we also want to check, we want to do an or here, not an and, because we want to check either or. and priority, if that is equal to, in this case, let's say 0, because it has an initial value, right? If we look at the form here, select priority, we don't want this to be selected, and that has a value of 0, so we want to just check for that. And then if either of those are true, then let's just alert, and we'll say, let's say, please fill in all fields. And then we're just going to return from that. Okay, so if I leave both empty and I click add item, I get please fill in all fields. If I just do milk and I don't select the priority, I get the fill in all fields. And notice it's not console logging these because I returned from the function here. So let's choose a priority and make sure we have that filled in. And now we don't get the alert and we get the console log. So this is just very, very simple form validation. Now, I also want to show you how to use the form data object. So what I'm going to do is create another function, and I'll call this on submit to. And let's have this now submit to that function. And we still want to prevent the default behavior. And then what I'll do is initialize a form data variable and set that to new, and then form data with a capital F. Okay, and then we want to pass in our form, which we have up here. So this is in the global scope, meaning I can access it anywhere else. So I'll just pass in my form here. And then what I want to do is just console log that form data and see and show you what that gives us. All right, so if we submit this with milk priority 1, and if we look in here, it might not work how you may think. We don't just have direct access to the values, like an object of values, but in the prototype, you can see that there's a bunch of methods here. So if you just want to get each individual entry, then you can use the get method. So let's do that. Let's set, let's say const item, and we're going to set that to our form data variable. And then there's a get method, and what we'll do is pass in the item into here. All right, now this item is actually the name. So if we look at the input here, the name. So if you're using the form data object, you want to make sure you have a name for these. The name for this one is priority. So the next one, just copy that down and set that to priority because that's the name that we assigned. And this is a newer way of doing this and getting values. So console log item and priority. So now I'm going to, again, just choose milk, choose 1, and add item, and now I'm getting those values. Now we can also get all of the entries using the entries method, which is a little weird, but I'll show you how that works. So let's say const entries, and we're going to set that to our form data variable, and then dot entries with parentheses because it's a method. And then I'm just going to comment these out, and then let's console log what entries gives us. So again, I'll choose milk 1 and add, and what we get is an iterator. So this iterator, basically it allows us to loop through it or to iterate through it. So an easy way of doing this is to use a for of. So we could come down here and say for, and let's say let entry, so that's what we'll call each entry of, and then the iterator, which is entries. Okay, and then in here, if I console log entry, let's comment this one out and select milk and 1. So what it gives me is for each input or each item, it gives me an array that has both the name and the value. So if I wanted to access the value, I could do, let's say, entry and 1, because this is just a simple array with a 0 index and a 1 index. So if I do that and I submit this again, then I get milk and I get 1. And of course you can get the title as well, or I should say the name, so item and priority, so you can get either one of those. And there's a lot more to the form data object that we might get into later, but I wanted to show you at least the basics of that. But in most cases, for something simple like this, I mean, just using dot value is fine. Now in the next video, we're going to get into something that's pretty important, and that's called event bubbling.